When we think of the term war hero, we think of people like David Crockett, who along with his fellow Texans held off several thousand Mexican soldiers at the Battle of the Alamo in 1836. Feats of incredible bravery and courage are often the feature of Hollywood films, but these tend to glorify the situations that the soldiers find themselves in. When you dig through the annals of time, you'll find that a lot of the true war heroes operated behind the scenes, generally on the intelligence side of war, and Witold Pilecki was no exception. I really wanted to hear this story, as it's been scrubbed from mainstream history, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you will feel the same way I do about this incredible man. Witold Pilecki was a Rittmeister in the Polish cavalry and also founder of the secret Polish army. He began his military career during the Polish-Bolshevik War of 1920, where he took part in many partisan activities behind enemy lines after the Bolsheviks overran the Wilno area. He later fought as a cavalryman in the Kiev offensive of 1920 and the Battle of Warsaw. Afterwards, Pilecki aided the liberation effort of Wilno. This was all at the start of his career. He had carved out a reputation as being a steadfast and reliable soldier in the face of adversity. Fast forward to September 1st, 1939. Pilecki would be called up again, but this time he was to defend his homeland from a much more dire threat. The Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939 was a deliberate and bloody offensive that cost the lives of just under 200,000 Polish nationals. It is unknown whether Pilecki's platoon of cavalry were any of the ill-fated Warsaw Panzer Charge. This is where members of the Polish cavalry charged the invading Nazi panzer tanks. You can imagine how that turned out for the soldiers, and for the horses. However, Pilecki's platoon, like many of the Polish military forces, took heavy casualties in their effort to halt the Nazi invasion of Poland. But don't mistake them as defenseless. Pilecki's platoon alone destroyed 7 German tanks, shot down 1 fighter plane, and destroyed 2 more that were grounded. Unfortunately, his valiant defence wasn't enough to stop the advancement of the Nazi war machine, and eventually he retreated back to Warsaw with his commander. This is where he and his commander founded the Polish Secret Army, or in Polish is the Tajna Armia Polska, one of the first underground operations in Polish history. Less than a year later, the TAP had amassed 8,000 members. It was at this time that Pilecki approached the TAP with one of his most daring and courageous plans. He and his fellow comrades had been hearing first and second-hand stories about the horror being carried out at the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, and was the driving force behind him taking such daring action. The plan was for Pilecki to infiltrate Auschwitz concentration camp by voluntarily being captured by the Nazis. At the time of the plan's inception, very little was known about the true nature of the camp or how the Nazis ran it. Many thought that Auschwitz was a large internment camp or a prison camp, rather than the death factory it was. The idea of Pilecki's plan was to gather and report intelligence on the camp itself, but to primarily organise some kind of inmate resistance so they could rise against their captors and break free. This man was not only willing to risk his own life, but to risk brutal treatment at the hands of the Nazis for the sake of all those who were imprisoned at Auschwitz to free them. The plan was approved, and his superiors set him up with the identity of Thomas Sarnowski, and in mid-September 1940, Pilecki walked out in the streets during a Nazi roundup, and along with thousands of other Warsaw civilians, was arrested and ready to be shipped out to prisons across Poland. Pilecki noted the appalling treatment of the Polish civilians during and after the Warsaw roundup. Polish citizens were often beaten by groups of Nazis with rubber truncheons. Sometimes, in the process, the Nazis would kill them. Not only did Pilecki risk these beatings himself, but he also faced a growing number of risks. There was nothing to stop the Nazis taking offence to the way he looked or dressed, and shooting him dead, right there in the street, or worse, being recognised as a cavalry captain he was, and being subjected to enemy of the state treatment. Not only that, Pilecki and his superiors could not be 100% certain that after his arrest he would be transported to Auschwitz and not some other camp, such as Treblinka, which was much closer. It was a huge risk for Pilecki, and was one that took an incredible amount of courage. Amazingly, the plan worked, and Witold Pilecki was transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. Due to the poor state of the health of the prisoners in the camp, almost on the day of his arrival, he contracted pneumonia. Regardless, Pilecki continued on with his plan, and within the first few weeks of arrival, he managed to organise a union of underground resistance fighters with the aim of sowing dissidence in the camp. This was based on the idea that Auschwitz was being used as a prisoner of war camp rather than an extermination camp that it was. It didn't take long for Pilecki to comprehend the true nature of the camp, something that in retrospect we can only imagine what he must have felt on first witnessing. Pilecki was faced with the constant threat of execution, most of which was carried out by camp guards or officers at random. Pilecki slowly realised that the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp was actually being used as the extermination camp that we all know it to be today. He would later produce a document in which he stated that prisoners at Auschwitz were often led away to an area of the camp called the Black Wall, where the Nazis stood inmates against it and opened fire with machine guns. Appalled by what he saw, Pilecki felt a renewed sense of vigour and determination, and began focusing on improving the morale of the prisoners at the camp by distributing extra food and clothing to the most needy. Pilecki also ensured to distribute news of what was happening in the war, but also to train detachments in the camp in the event that a liberating force arrived, so the prisoners could rise up from the inside. Of course, none of this mattered if Pilecki couldn't get the information about the activities at the camp to his superiors. Pilecki managed to get his reports to the Polish underground in Warsaw, and less than a year later, his reports came to the attention of Winston Churchill himself. Churchill encouraged Pilecki and the Polish government to continue his work, and he assisted the Polish underground in any way he could. Pilecki and the fellow inmates had managed to build a radio transmitter with smuggled and scavenged parts from around the camp, which he used to report back to London, where the Polish government in exile was now based. Pilecki's reports were nothing short of harrowing. He documented the amounts of arrivals to the camp, and compared them to the amount of exterminations. He concluded that people were being shipped in and exterminated almost on the same day. Pilecki's reports were the primary source of intelligence for the whole of the Allied forces on Auschwitz, allowing them to spread stories of the Nazi atrocities throughout the world and also to the soldiers fighting on the front lines. Pilecki's men soon grew concerned that camp officers would discover the radio transmitter, which it would result in immediate execution for all those involved. Unfortunately, this was due to the loose tongue of a fellow inmate. After they dismantled the radio, Pilecki grew concerned that the Polish Home Army were taking too long to launch a liberation effort. By this time, he'd been in Auschwitz for nearly 2 years. Now let's take a moment to truly understand what that would mean for him. Despite the constant threat of physical harm and abuse from the Nazis, Pilecki also had to sleep in unheated huts during the Polish winter, in little other else than a thin prison outfit made out of cotton. It wasn't uncommon in the concentration camps, and especially Auschwitz, for prisoners to wake up only to find that someone in the hut had frozen to death during the night. Couple this with the fact that disease and illness were rife, the odds of Pilecki contracting a serious illness was very high. Prisoners' immune systems weren't exactly kept in peak condition either, due to the fact that prisoners were generally fed a bowl of broth per day, and if they were lucky, small pieces of bread would also be available. And just surviving on one bowl of broth per day would be difficult, but then doing long days of hard labour doubled that effort. His day-to-day life, along with the lives of hundreds of thousands of others, must have been the true definition of hell on earth. And let us remember, he volunteered for this, all in an effort to help the Allied forces beat the Nazis, but also to help those who were imprisoned under the horrendous Nazi regime. Due to Pilecki's reports, any kind of liberation attempt was deemed impossible, much to his dismay. Bombing the camp was out of the question, due to the high number of unavoidable prisoner casualties, and launching an armed assault from the ground meant crossing the entire breadth of southern Nazi-occupied Poland. At this point, the Gestapo were certain that the Polish government had infiltrated one of the concentration camps, and doubled their efforts to ferret out and murder Polish resistance fighters. Pilecki decided that the only way he could convince the Allied forces to attack Auschwitz was in person. So one night in 1943, when he was assigned sentry shift on a bakery, he determined that this would be an ideal time to break out. He and 2 of his comrades in arms, in the middle of the night, overpowered one of the guards, cut phone lines to the camp, and successfully fled with stolen Nazi accounting information. He spent almost a week on the run, but eventually managed to make contact with Polish forces. He went straight to his commanders, who again deemed that they did not have the strength to liberate Auschwitz. As a result, Pilecki saw no sense in returning to the camp, and decided to engage in activities on the front line in an effort to drive back the Nazis. In doing this, he hoped to push the Nazis back far enough so that the liberation of Auschwitz became a possibility. He spent the next year engaging in underground activities, anything he could to disrupt Nazi operations. By this time, the Soviet army had made tremendous gains on the Eastern Front, and had begun liberating parts of Poland. Because of this, the Polish government approached the Soviet commanders for assistance in liberating Auschwitz. Unfortunately, the Soviets showed no interest in a joint operation to liberate the camp, despite the fact that Auschwitz was now gassing millions of people, many of whom were killed almost on arrival. The cold shoulder given by the Red Army alarmed the Polish government and led them to believe that the Soviets weren't hoping to completely liberate Poland, but rather to occupy it with their own forces. As a result, Pilecki joined another underground resistance movement, but this time focusing on anti-communist activities. The Nazis were being pushed further and further back by the Soviets, and the occupying soldiers became weaker and weaker as many of them were being diverted to the Eastern Front in an effort to halt the Red Army from advancing. Pilecki, along with other members of the Polish Home Army, were instrumental in instigating the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, and again volunteered to be part of a platoon, but fighting this time with the rank of private. He felt that this made him close to the men on the front line. But as those in command of the uprising began falling all around him, they were left leaderless. And again, during the resistance fighters' darkest hour, Pilecki rose to the occasion and declared his true identity as the cavalry captain that he was. Pilecki took command of the remaining forces. After a bloody campaign, Pilecki was forced to surrender for the sake of his men. The Nazis agreed to imprison those responsible rather than putting them against a firing squad. For the rest of World War II, Pilecki was a prisoner of war. The POW camp that he was at was liberated by the Soviets in 1945. He again returned straight to combat in Italy and used his time stationed there to produce a document detailing the atrocities committed at Auschwitz. By this time the Soviet army were occupying many of the liberated parts of Poland. Because of this, the relationship between the Soviet-backed Polish government and the original Polish government in exile became incredibly tenuous. Pilecki had spent the last 12 months gathering information and intelligence on the Soviet government, but eventually the Polish government in exile determined that the positions of anti-communist activists in Poland were now untenable, and Pilecki was ordered to flee to Western Europe. He declined this, and was determined to collect enough evidence of Soviet atrocities in Poland so he could bring it to the attention of the world media and show the world the true face of the Soviet government. I wish that I could tell you that Witold Pilecki succeeded in his efforts, as this man's only crime was wanting to free his beloved homeland from oppression. In the summer of 1947, Pilecki was arrested by the Soviet Ministry of Public Security. He was due to be charged with various acts of espionage, and prior to his trial he was subjected to brutal and illegal torture, the very treatment he'd been hoping to reveal to the world. But again, Pilecki's main concern was not for himself, but rather for the other prisoners, and despite being subjected to incredible pain, he revealed nothing of his activities. Pilecki's trial will go down in history as nothing short of a farce, and was simply used as a warning to other would-be dissidents that this would be their fate should they choose to rebel against the Soviets. Needless to say, he was found guilty of numerous charges, namely espionage, spying for a foreign power, which in this case was Britain, crossing the border illegally, assassination and forgery. One of the most upsetting facts about his trial was that a former inmate of Auschwitz, Józef Rozansky, testified against him. This was one of the very men that Pilecki had risked his life to save. Pilecki, unafraid of what was to come, pled guilty to most of the charges, apart from assassination and illegal border crossing. He was sentenced to death, and on the 25th of May 1948, Pilecki was led out to a wall in Mokotów prison, much like how he had seen thousands of prisoners killed at Auschwitz, and was executed with a single shot to the back of the head. Pilecki's last words before he was killed were, "Long live Free Poland." I hope you can see that this is quite an upsetting story. To many this will be a grave miscarriage of justice. As I said before, Witold Pilecki's only crime was wishing to see his beloved homeland free from oppression. For his efforts, he was murdered by the communist Polish government, forcibly established by Moscow as Stalin sought to subvert the liberation of Poland into the creation of an extended Soviet Union. Many years later, the Polish government redacted all of his charges, found the surviving members of Pilecki's original prosecution, and charged them all with complicity in his murder. In 1995, Pilecki was posthumously given the award for outstanding achievements in military careers, and in 2006 was decorated with the Order of the White Eagle, which is the highest Polish honour anyone can achieve. A few years later, he was again posthumously promoted to the rank of colonel. There are a few people who are worthy of the word hero, but let alone war hero. Pilecki's story was one that I just had to share, and all I ask is that we remember Witold Pilecki as the selfless and courageous man that he was. I think Pilecki would be incredibly proud to see the nation that Poland has turned out to be today. Big thank you for all those who watch this video. Be sure to subscribe as I release new content every week, and I'll see you next week for 7 real terrifying cases of demonic possession.